Hi, I'm Peter Ritchie and welcome to Kayak Fishing Unboxed. Today we're going to talk about the tides and how that it can affect you fishing. Keeping in mind that this presentation is designed for the brand new kayak anglers, people who've got no experience or very limited experience at all, or might be venturing into an area with a high tidal flow for the first time. Just trying to give you a better understanding of how to interpret and read tide charts. This presentation is also best viewed on a computer or a larger screen, not so much on the phone, because a lot of the images I draw aren't going to be very visible. So keep that in mind if you're watching this and you can't see what I'm drawing, that's why. Okay, so first things first, the tides are caused by the gravitational effect of the moon. So as the moon circles the Earth, as it goes over a body of water, it draws the water towards it. And then as it goes away from that body of water, the water returns back to where it was before. So as the moon circles the Earth, it keeps pulling the water towards it. So that's why we have a tidal range. Now, the difference between the high tide and the low tide is called the tidal range. So if you look at the image on the bottom left where I've got tide range, you can see that. And what we're going to do is just make sure the pen's working, because sometimes it doesn't. Okay, right, so on the bottom of the screen, we've got the tide range. And that's the low tide. And then at the top of the arrow, we've got the high tide. So the difference between the low tide and the high tide is called the range. Now that doesn't stay constant. Some days the low tide will be here and the high tide will be up here. So the tidal range will change. Now the other thing that we need to consider when we're looking at the tides is the tidal flow. So when you've got low tide here, which equates to low tide over here, the water starts running back into the bay until it reaches the top here. But that flow of water into the bay isn't constant. So at low tide, there's no movement. And then the tide starts flowing back into the bay. And then in the second hour, it flows faster and faster. And in the third hour of the tide change, it's flowing at the fastest. Now, on average, it takes 6 hours to move from low tide to high tide, on average, as a general rule. That can vary slightly, but as a general rule, 6 hours. So halfway through the tide difference, we get to the maximum tidal flow, which is the current, the speed that the water's moving at. And then it slowly starts to slow down again until we get to the high tide. And then there's zero flow. So the speed at which the water flows between low tide and high tide is not the same. It slowly increases till it gets to its strongest, and then it starts decreasing again until it's zero. Now, what affects the tidal flow or the current is actually the range. So if you have a small range like this one, for instance, the tidal flow might be at one speed, but as the tidal flow will be at one speed, as the range increases, you've got the same amount of water has to flow. So you've got an increased amount of water that has to flow in the same amount of time. So it doesn't matter what the tide range is, it still has 6 hours to flow in and out. So the greater the tide range, the more water that has to flow in and out, which then obviously means that the tidal flow has to be stronger. So let's put that into a little bit of perspective and have a look at it, what it looks like on a tide chart itself. So we'll just swap screens. Right. So here's just a normal forecast tide chart. So we'll just pick, let's say, have a look at what's happening on Friday the 29th. So we'll look at Friday the 29th here. We can see that on Friday there's two low tides. There's a low tide here and a low tide here. There's a high tide here and there's a high tide here. What we can see though is the difference between those tides, the low and the high on each one, is substantially different. So we know that on this tide here, the tidal flow will be, not quite half, but a lot less than this tidal flow here. So if you wanted to go fishing as a beginner, you'd say, well, hang on, this will be the day when there's least tidal flow. So if I want to fish a high tide, this should be a good one because there's the least flow coming in. What we need to be cautious of, though, is it's a lot of flow outwards. So the tide will come in slowly, but it will run out quickly. If you said, well, I want to have a fish, what's going to be let's call it the safest period of least tidal flow? And it doesn't matter which example we use, but let's have a look at this one here. So here's a low tide. So my suggestion would be, well, if you fish the tide going from high to low, and then from low to high, that's a good low tidal flow to go in. The opposite would be this tide. This has got a big range both ways. So there's going to be a lot of flow both ways. Now, I'm not saying you can't fish here. What I'm saying as a beginner, try and focus on that one if you can get it. Now, the tide charts don't always look like this. Quite often they're even. There's no difference. There's no variation. But if you get something like this, it's a good, easy way to go out and just test your skills first. Test the tide flow, see how it affects your kayak. And then as you've got more experience, you can potentially experiment with stronger tide flows. So if you're looking for a fish, you say, well, I want to go fishing. Let's say I go next Wednesday as an RDO. What are my choices as a beginner? You probably want to avoid this bit here because that's going to be the strongest tide flow. So fishing here and over the top of the high tide, low tide, high tide, or even the end of this high tide and then the run out tide again. You can see that area here is going to be a lot safer than this area here for a beginner. So keep that in mind next time you have a look at a tide chart. And this is a great way to see it visually. If you can't see it represented like this, then you have to use the numbers on the side. So you can see here, that's about a 0.5 or 0.6, and up here it's almost a 3 feet. So there's a big change there. You can also see along the bottom here, if you draw a straight line, the tide's never constant. So those lows are slowly getting deeper, and these lows here are slowly getting deeper, and the bottom ones are getting shallower. The same with the high tide, it changes. It's not always at the same high tide. It's getting the high tide down this end is getting lower. So it's always varying the tide. So really pays to sit down and have a look if you can. Something like this is a graph. Now, we spoke about Port Phillip Bay on the previous video and how that's affected by the tides. And the top end of Port Phillip Bay doesn't have a lot of tidal flow because there's not a lot of water. I'm going to use Western Port Bay as an example this time because it is a lot stronger, the tidal flow. So we'll use a couple of screens. So in this one, if you've got a low tide, and hopefully you can see this on a low tide, the water runs in the bay to the top end, runs around here, and it runs up here. Once it reaches the top of the bay, sits there, says low, and then it turns and runs out again. So the tide flow goes this way, and then when it runs out, it obviously goes the opposite. So it comes down here, in this area here, it can go this way as well. Now, this western entrance is quite wide. So, and you can see it's not like Port Phillip Bay, which has got a big bottleneck at Portsea, Sereno area. Now, the flow here, though, is still really strong, and there's a lot of reasons. One, there's a large volume of water moving, but there's a lot of disturbances, shallow reefs, sandbars that make this whole area really quite treacherous to a kayak in strong flows. The coastline's a bit different. That's a lot more protected and not quite as severe. Look on this side over the San Remo, Cape Woolamai area, you can see we've got another one of these V's. And what that V is it means that you've got all this water here trying to funnel through this little narrow opening here, then back out into Bass Strait. Tidal flows through here can be quite severe because it's a narrow opening and there's a lot of water trying to move through there, similar to Port Phillip Heads, but perhaps not quite as bad, but it still flows really strongly. So if you are going to fish in this area down here, make sure you read the tide charts. Make sure you don't go out when there's a strong tidal flow. Western Port's also unique because there's a lot of gutters, channels up that end of the bay, up the top end of the bay, where as the tide recedes, the mud's exposed, but there's still a narrow channel with a lot of water running through it. So you need to be a little bit wary about that as well. So that's on a low tide. And then on the high tide, obviously it's the same. High tide, the water starts running out and going that way. So that hopefully gives you a better idea of fishing in Western Port in relation to the tides. Now, one other thing we need to look at, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, so try and stay with me. If you want to fish safely in Western Port on a northerly, so the wind's going from the north, give or take, it's going that way, northerly wind, blowing that way a bit. You want to be fishing when the tide's running that way, in this area here, all right? Northerly winds blowing that way, you want the tide running that way to have the maximum flatness on the water. So we want the water to be going from high tide to low tide. So you want to fish here on the high tide because we know that in a northerly, this end of the bay, the wind's going to be that way going north to south. The tide's going from the high to the low, so it's running out, so it's going that way, and everything's working smoothly. Same on this side, a northerly will be blowing that way down the page, and so will the tide on the run out tide. Northerly. Now, I'm only talking light northerlies. Where you need to be careful, first of all, you need to have a look at the tidal flow. So this is where it gets a bit complicated. You want to make sure that you're not fishing in too strong a tidal flow, particularly if it changes and the tide starts running against the wind. That in this area here can chop up really bad, as all of it can, to be honest. None of it's pleasant when the wind is against the tide. So really focus on trying to avoid that situation if you can, and also try and fish there on a small tidal range when there's a low tidal flow. And that way then you'll have the minimal discomfort that you can and be as safe as possible. And that's only to get your experience to level up. So what I'm saying is this is really, if you're only going to go out and have a look at Western Port Bay for the first few times, well, go with a mate if you can, first of all. And secondly, try and do it when it's the least tide and the least wind, just to get an understanding of how it all works. I am going to do another video later about safety. I'm going to cover off on a couple of things about fishing in tidal areas and doing it safely. However, what I want you to do, and I'll just put this screen up now, this is a video that Brendan Wing made. Came about, Brendan and I had a chat a little while ago, when unfortunately as a kayaker drowned off Summers Beach. He's out fishing with his mate, fell over the side, didn't have a PFD on, and got swept away. And I was talking to Brendan about what happens if you fall out of your kayak in a strong current. And he didn't believe me that quite often people couldn't get back to their kayaks if they tried. So he actually went and experimented with a boat in different circumstances. Absolutely watch this video if you're going to fish strong tidal flow in Western Port, and make sure you respect the speed at which the water can travel. If your kayak's anchored and you fall over the side and you're not ready for it and you're not a good swimmer, you might not make it back to your kayak, and then you're drifting away. Same applies as if it's a strong wind going one way and a tide going the other. If you're in the water, you'll get towed away by the current, the flow. The kayak, however, might be blown in the opposite direction by the wind, because the wind will affect the kayak more than the current will, generally speaking. So have a watch of that one. That's certainly a good one to look at. Now, what we're going to do now is change to another screen and just give you a demonstration of how to read the tide at Lang Lang. Okay, so now we've got, and this is a Willy Weather tide chart. So it's just showing Lang Lang. Now Lang Lang's part of Western Port Bay on the eastern side. Very popular with kayak fishermen. There's a range of fish there you can catch. A lot of it's shallow water, some deeper channels, but it's quite tidal. Now, as you can see in this screen, the actual tidal variations between the high and the low tide are fairly constant, as in there's no bigger days or smaller days. It's just fairly constant tidal flow. So at Lang Lang, we know that there needs to be 1.8 meters of water to launch a kayak or return. So what we're going to talk about, let's look at having a fish on Sunday. So Sunday, we'll pick the tide. So we can see if we move this line across, we want the tide depth to be 1.8 meters. Actually, we'll go this way. We want to go for a fish Sunday afternoon. All right. So we have a look at the tide and we move it across and give or take 3:48, 4 o'clock, around about 4 o'clock. Oh, come on. Around about 4 o'clock, we can see that's going to be 1.9 meters. So we know that's the time that we can launch the kayak. And we can then launch the kayak and go out and fish all the way over the high tide into the dark. But as we come down the other side of the tide range, we can only fish until round about 10:46. So we want to be really aiming to be back on shore at 10:30. That means we've got enough water to not walk through the mud at Lang Lang and make it back to the boat ramp easily. The good news about that tide range is that if you launch here, you can return to Lang Lang anytime you like up until about 10:30. But what if you want to fish the low tide instead? You think, well, I'm going to fish the low tide change because I want to fish the channels and the gutters. So again, same principle. We say, all right, well, let's move the tide arm along. We basically have to launch by 9:30 a.m. So we launch the kayak 9:30 a.m. There's enough water to get out. We then go out and fish, and we have to come back in. I think it was about 4 o'clock, give or take. So we have to return no earlier than 4 o'clock. So the difficulty with fishing the low tide in this area is you actually can't return to shore at any point in time here until about 4 o'clock because it's mud and it's deep, sticky mud, and it can take, if you're a long way out, you might not even be able to make it back to shore walking through the knee-deep, waist-deep mud. So this is then where you need to be very careful about the weather, because you don't want to go out in this area of the tide range if the conditions are marginal, because you can't get back to shore. You're going to be stuck on mud somewhere, hopefully safely. Better to be safe on mud than drowning, obviously, but you can't get back to shore. So great time to go fishing, but keep in mind you're going to be on the contact for a long period of time. I'm going to be on the kayak for a long period of time. Thanks again for watching. I'm Peter Ritchie.